So I'm here with Saleemul Huq from IIED, and Saleem, you've been following these negotiations very quickly, kind of closely for a long time now. Just kind of quickly, could you give us an overview of the first week? Have we seen progress? Is there reason to be optimistic?
I think there is a reason to be reasonably optimistic. People are in a much more realistic mood now. They think that the approach that they took in Copenhagen of an all-or-nothing deal isn't going to be realistic for Cancun, and therefore something is better than nothing, and trying to figure out what the something is and moving towards that. I think on some of the tracks we have some good reaching near agreement. The critical issue is going to be the fast-track funding and how that's going to be made available, how much and through which channels. But if that's resolved, then I think we may have agreement on some of the tracks in Cancun.
Okay, and that seems to be the positive message that's coming out of here. People don't necessarily agree, and there's still a lot that needs to be discussed, but at least people are around the table now, at least the parties are talking. What is the technical progress that's being made? Where are we seeing developments?
I think we're seeing developments, quite good developments, on three of the negotiating tracks. The first one is on adaptation. Everybody agrees it's important for the developing countries, particularly the more vulnerable countries. It's a question now of how much of the money is going to go for that and how will that be distributed. The other one is on the reducing emissions from deforestation and degradation, the RED. Again, very close to agreement, a lot of interest in that. And the third one is on technology transfer, which again, it's near agreement. All three of these really depend on how the $30 billion fast-track funding over 3 years gets distributed across these three themes and then channeled through which channels. And there's a bit of a debate there with the contributing countries who are putting the money in, preferring to put it through their own channels, like their own bilateral aid agencies or the World Bank, and developing countries in the UNFCCC process preferring to have the funds channeled through the UNFCCC funds and process. But that needs to be resolved between now and Cancun.
And finance has been a massive issue kind of underpinning these talks, I think partly because it was, it had a big place in the Copenhagen Accord. And IIED recently released a report talking about the importance of transparency and having a baseline to measure this finance. Has there been any progress on that front?
I think so. I think the realization that the funding that's been promised needs to be reported and tracked in a manner that is acceptable to everybody is now generally agreed, and the paper that you refer to is something that we put forward, saying that the first thing we have to agree is what's the baseline against which we measure what is new and additional. New from when, additional to what. And that hasn't been resolved yet, but hopefully it can be resolved. It's not something that's irresolvable.
And you said there's been some progress on RED. Conversely, around LULUCF, which is kind of land use, land change and forestry, one of the acronyms here at the UN. This seems to have been quite a contentious issue. Can you kind of enlighten our viewers as to why this is causing a bit of trouble?
I'm afraid I can't. I don't follow LULUCF or RED issues that closely to tell you what the nuances of the agreement or disagreements are. But broadly speaking, the sort of contentious issue is whether or not the funds that come to the forestry sector come under a market mechanism like the Clean Development Mechanism, which some countries prefer, or they come under a funding mechanism where the countries just get straight allocations of amounts for protecting their forests. There are some countries that prefer the latter, some countries that prefer the former, and working things out is still unresolved. But I think it can be resolved.
Okay, one of the major issues obviously is the emissions levels. This is something which is fundamental to this. Are we actually discussing that yet? There seems to be a lot of procedural politics going around, like where debates are going to take place, which track of the negotiations they're going to take place in. Are we actually talking about emissions levels here?
I think the emissions level is the big nut that we're not going to crack by Cancun. There are several elements to that have to be in place before a resolution will happen at the international level. The first biggest one is U.S. domestic legislation. Unless the U.S. has domestic legislation to cap their emissions, they're not going to enter into any legally binding agreement. And without the U.S., China's not going to do it. Without the U.S., the Kyoto Protocol Annex 1 parties aren't going to. So it's a bottleneck there. If that's resolved, then it might well be possible for the other countries to come forward and come to an agreement, but I don't see that happening before Cancun. The level of those agreements on mitigation are really the more contentious sticking point. The offers of or pledges of reductions that have come from the United States and from the non-Annex 1 large countries like China, India, Brazil, etc., are quite significant, but they're simply not enough. They don't solve the problem. They don't lead us to less than 2 degrees temperature rise. They're headed more towards a 4-degree temperature rise, and they know that. So they're going to have to ramp up their level of ambition if they really want to solve the problem. And there simply isn't the political will in their own countries at the moment to do that. So we are beholden to politics in the US and politics in some of the other big countries to shift in a better direction, hopefully in the next few years, but definitely unlikely before Cancun.
Okay. And you've said kind of some of the bigger nuts that we're not going to crack. What are the deal breakers here? Is there anything, you've said finance, for example, needs to be solved to kind of lubricate this deal. Is there anything else that might crop up that's going to turn everything on its head? So far people seem to be talking fairly reasonably. Is there any danger of things going badly wrong?
Well, there are a couple of sort of potential spoilers out there. One of them is the fate and utilization of the so-called Copenhagen Accord. Most countries, even those that have signed up to it, feel that it was interesting, but it's not relevant. We should bring whatever was agreed in the Copenhagen Accord into the negotiations themselves. The US seems to be the only country that wishes the Copenhagen Accord to have a life of its own, and is trying very hard to maintain that. I don't think they'll succeed, and they'll bend in the end and allow it to be imported, the contents of it to be imported into the negotiating text, which is basically what we need to do. The other spoilers may be some countries that really don't want a deal at all will hold up things on procedural matters, and particularly on this all or nothing approach. Unless everything is agreed, nothing is agreed. That used to be a very strong mantra from many of the developing countries. I think most of them are now much more realistic and say, let's agree on what we can agree and leave the rest for later. But some countries will take a maximalist approach and try to hold everything up to the end. But I think both of those will be solvable.
And just finally, you mentioned that we're kind of beholden to US domestic politics, and then there's these other issues now which kind of crop up, and a lot of this is very technical. What room is there for campaigners, for activists watching at home to actually kind of get energized and start moving this process along? Where's the scope for activism here?
Well, I think the scope for campaigners is actually much more significant now because, as I said, the international process is beholden to domestic politics, and particularly in large developed countries in Europe, Japan, and particularly the United States. So campaigners need to be putting pressure on their leaders in these countries to do the right thing, to take their responsibilities seriously and to step up to the plate in terms of delivering what they say. They all say the right things, they say what they want, nobody disagrees with that, but they don't deliver it. And they have to deliver it, and their citizens have to demand and tell them that they will support them for doing this. At the moment, there are lobby groups within each of these countries that don't want action, that are much more powerful that the politicians listen to. The people and campaigners need to be able to countervail those voices coming from powerful vested interests, particularly from the fossil fuel industries, and tell their leaders that they need to do the right thing.
It's interesting to note we've kind of got a Gulf oil spill at the moment, and looking through the participants list here, there's several lobbyists from the oil industry, so kind of brings the issue home that these are two very interconnected issues. Okay, Saleemul Huq, thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll talk to you later in the week. Okay, thank you very much.